Okay, so today we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff. We're talking Martin Heidegger
Indeed.
and specifically being and time. I mean, even just saying the title, you kind of feel the weight of it, you
Oh,
know?
absolutely. It's
Yeah.
it's one of those works that's well, notorious, I guess, in philosophy,
Right. Like everyone knows it's important, hugely influential,
hugely.
but actually getting through it, like really grappling with it,
It can be a bit daunting.
that's putting it mildly.
Yeah, a bit daunting.
So what we're going to try to do in this deep dive is sort of extract the core insights. Like, what are the absolute essentials you need to grasp Heidegger's project?
Right, because the impact is so broad. I mean, you can't talk about existentialism, deconstruction, critical theory.
All that postmodern stuff.
Exactly, without Heidegger looming large. And even beyond philosophy, right? Theology, literary theory, even psychology, social sciences.
I mean, it's about the nature of being, so it kind of touches everything in a way. So we're going to unpack some key arguments, key concepts. Obviously, we can't cover every detail, but we'll give you the framework.
The tools to navigate the terrain.
Exactly. So what are the fundamental questions Heidegger's asking, and why should we still care, all these years later?
Right. So let's maybe start with the man himself, a little bit of context.
Okay.
He was born in Germany, Meßkirch, small rural town, very Catholic upbringing.
This is important, right? This background, because you can see it in his work.
Yeah, you can absolutely trace how his early life, that rural environment, that connection to, craft work and practical activity.
Not just abstract ideas.
Exactly. It really permeates his thinking. You see it in the way he talks about dwelling, the way he emphasizes being in the world, not just thinking about it.
Okay. And then academically, he took a pretty interesting path.
Right. He dabbled in a few things. He started with theology, then moved to the natural sciences, even mathematics.
Wow.
And then finally, philosophy. University of Freiburg. That's where he settled.
And even in his early philosophical work, you can see the seeds of what's to come, right?
Absolutely. His doctoral thesis was on the concept of judgment. Pretty technical stuff, really digging into logic and psychology. And then his habilitation, that's like a second dissertation in the German system, was on Duns Scotus, the medieval philosopher.
So he wasn't just, coming out of nowhere. He was engaging with this whole tradition of thought.
Absolutely. And you can see how he's already wrestling with these deep metaphysical questions, setting the stage for his radical reinterpretation of ontology.
Okay, and then comes the big one. Husserl.
Right. Edmund Husserl, the father of phenomenology. Huge influence on Heidegger.
I mean, being and time is dedicated to him.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
But their relationship was not complicated. It wasn't just a simple case of, student follows teacher.
There was some tension there.
There was, yeah. I mean, Heidegger absorbed a lot from Husserl, particularly the emphasis on lived experience and the phenomenological method.
Yeah.
But he also saw limitations in Husserl's transcendental idealism. He wanted to push phenomenology further, deeper into a more fundamental ontology.
So the dedication is interesting, historically, but it shouldn't mask the fact that they ended up diverging on some pretty fundamental points.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were both giants, but ultimately charting different paths.
Okay, so after Freiburg, Heidegger moves to the University of Marburg.
Yeah, and that's where things really start to take off.
Mhm.
He's teaching there until 28.
And he has some pretty famous students, right?
Oh, yeah. Some heavy hitters. Gadamer, Arndt, Lois, Jonas.
Wow. I mean, that must have been an incredible time to be in his orbit.
Oh, I imagine so. His lectures from that period were legendary, just pushing the boundaries of what philosophy could be.
And it's there, in Marburg, that being and time really starts to take shape.
Yeah, it was a culmination of years of thinking, teaching, and wrestling with these fundamental questions about being.
Now, we're mainly focusing on being and time, but it's worth mentioning that his later work takes some interesting turns.
Right. He becomes increasingly preoccupied with the history of being, the power of language, technology.
Leaves him to the whole poetic dwelling thing.
Exactly. And while that's a whole other deep dive, it's important to remember that those later developments have their roots in the groundwork laid out in being and time.
Okay, so let's dive into the book itself. What's the central problem that Heidegger's grappling with?
Well, in his own words, it's the concrete working out of the question of the meaning, sin, of being.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it's the kind of sentence that makes you go back and read it 5 times.
Right. But for someone who's, studied metaphysics, it's a pretty radical shift.
Oh, absolutely. Traditional ontology was all about figuring out what is or why there is something. Heidegger's after something else entirely. He's asking what it means for something to be.
Okay, so not just what exists, but how do we even make sense of the idea of existence?
Exactly. Like, what is it that we grasp, even implicitly, when we say something is?
Right, and this gets to what some scholars call the intelligibility interpretation of being.
Right. It's the idea that being isn't some separate thing out there, like some object or property. It's the condition that makes intelligibility possible, the framework within which things can show up as meaningful, as mattering to us.
So it's not about defining being as some grand concept, but about understanding how it operates, how it shows up in our experience.
Exactly. It's about the sense of being, the way it makes things intelligible to us.
And this leads to Heidegger's idea of ontological pluralism.
Right. The idea that there isn't just one kind of being, one way for things to be.
And this is where things get really interesting, right?
Oh, yeah. This is where he starts making these crucial distinctions that are essential for understanding his whole project.
So he distinguishes between being and entities.
Yeah. Entities are the specific things we encounter in the world, the objects, events, processes, even abstract concepts. Being, on the other hand, isn't another entity. It's what makes those entities what they are, the basic character that allows them to show up as something.
Okay, so if I'm looking at, let's say, a tree.
Okay.
The tree itself, with all its specific characteristics, that's the entity.
Right.
But the fact that it even is a tree, that it has a way of being, that's being.
Exactly. And Heidegger emphasizes that being isn't static or simply present. It's something that's revealed, disclosed, brought to light.
Okay, and this is where humans come in, right?
Absolutely. Heidegger argues that this disclosure of being is fundamentally tied to Dasein. That's his term for human existence.
So we're not just another entity in the world. We have this special relationship to being.
Exactly. We're the beings who can ask the question of being, who can grasp it, understand it.
So by analyzing Dasein, by figuring out how we work, we can gain insight into being itself.
Precisely. It's a form of philosophical self-reflection aimed at uncovering the very conditions of intelligibility.
Okay, that's a pretty bold move.
Oh, absolutely. But that's Heidegger for you, always pushing the boundaries.
Okay, so within this framework of ontological pluralism, Heidegger lays out different kinds of being.
Right, different ways for things to be. In being and time, he focuses on three: availableness, occurrentness, and existence.
Okay, lots of violaces.
Yeah, Heidegger loves his jargon.
Let's break them down. First up, availableness, sometimes translated as readiness to hand.
Right, or handiness. It's about the way we engage with things in our everyday practical lives.
So not just thinking about them abstractly, but actually using them.
Exactly. And Heidegger uses this really rich term, bewantness. It's hard to translate perfectly, but it captures the idea of involvement, relevance, functionality, even what we might call affordance today.
Like how a thing allows for certain actions, certain possibilities.
Exactly. So with an available entity, it's not primarily about its objective properties, like its shape or size or color. It's about how it functions within a context of use, what it's for.
Okay, so the classic example is the hammer.
Right. You don't experience the hammer primarily as a piece of metal with a certain weight and density.
You experience it as something to hammer with.
Exactly. It's for hammering.
Yeah.
And in its being for hammering, it also points to other available entities. The nail, the wood, the whole project you're working on.
So it's not just the hammer in isolation, but the hammer within a whole web of meaning and purpose.
Exactly. And Heidegger says that an available entity really shows itself, reveals its being during our use of it.
So when you're actually hammering, in that moment, that's when the hammer is most fully being a hammer.
Exactly. And he says this engaged coping, this practical activity, requires circumspection.
Which is?
It's like this background awareness of the whole context of your activity. You're monitoring how things work together, how they afford possibilities, how they relate to each other.
So it's not conscious, like you're thinking, okay, the hammer goes here, the nail goes there.
No, it's pre-reflective. It's this skillful way of being in the world where you're just attuned to the whole situation.
Like when you're driving a car, you're not constantly thinking about the mechanics of the engine and the steering wheel.
Right. You're just doing it, skillfully navigating the whole situation.
And Dreyfus, he has this great example of the door.
Oh, yeah, the door.
Yeah.
Classic Dreyfus.
He says that when you're skillfully opening a door, you're not perceiving it as a door, like a separate object with certain properties.
They're just enacting the possibility of going through.
Right. The door recedes into the background of your action. It becomes part of the seamless flow of activity.
Exactly. And that's availableness.
Okay, so that's availableness. Now what about occurrentness?
Okay, occurrentness. This is where things get a little more abstract.
This is where things show up as objects, right?
Right. Like objects with fixed properties, independent of our use or engagement with them.
So the tree I mentioned earlier, if I'm just looking at it, not climbing it or chopping it down or anything, then it's a current.
Right. It's just there, present at hand, as Heidegger would say. And it's defined by its objective properties, its size, its shape, its color.
The kind of thing that science would study.
Exactly. It's the realm of natural laws, causal relationships, things existing in a kind of detached objectivity.
And Heidegger's point is that philosophy often takes this as the primary way of being, when actually most of our everyday encounters are with things in their availableness.
Right. He's flipping the script. He's saying that occurrentness is actually the exception, not the rule.
It's like when a tool breaks down.
Right. Or when you're trying to fix something, suddenly you have to pay attention to the specific parts, the material properties, the way they fit together.
You have to step back from that smooth flow of activity and analyze the object in isolation.
Exactly. And Heidegger even suggests that we have this natural tendency to see everything as a current, maybe because of the way language works or because of the influence of science and technology.
So we kind of forget that our primary way of being in the world is through this engaged coping, this skillful interaction with things in their availableness.
It's like we've become alienated from our own being in the world.
Okay, so we have availableness and occurrentness. And then, of course, there's existence, which is the being of Dasein.
Right, and this is where the bulk of being and time is focused.
Because ultimately, it's about us, about understanding what it means to be human.
Exactly. Dasein is Heidegger's term for human existence. He's using it instead of human or person to emphasize that he's not doing anthropology or psychology.
He's trying to get at the fundamental ontological structure of what it means to be a Dasein.
Precisely. And he says that Dasein is defined by its understanding of being. We're the beings for whom being is an issue.
So in a way, the whole question of being hinges on our understanding of it, on how we as Dasein are structured.
Absolutely. And to get a handle on that structure, he introduces this key concept, being in the world.
And it's hyphenated, right?
Yeah, because it's a unitary phenomenon. It's not like being and in and the world are separate things that just happen to be next to each other.
It's all one thing. It's the basic way in which Dasein exists.
Exactly. You can't separate the world from the self from the being in. They're all intertwined.
Okay, so let's try to unpack that a bit. First, what does Heidegger mean by the world?
Well, it's not just the totality of all objects out there, like a giant inventory of everything that exists.
It's more like the meaningful context in which we live and act.
Exactly. It's the world of our involvements, the places where we dwell, the things that matter to us.
So my home, my workplace, the places I go, the people I interact with.
That whole network of relationships and significance, that's the world.
And spatiality, how does that fit in?
Well, for Heidegger, it's not about objective space, like the kind that physicists measure.
Not just distances and coordinates.
Right. It's about the way Dasein inhabits space, how we orient ourselves, how we make places familiar through our activities and concerns.
So the way I experience my home is different from the way a surveyor would map it out.
Exactly. And there's something interesting here that our source points out, which is that Heidegger doesn't really go into detail about the role of the body in all of this.
The physical body.
Right. He says it's not just a thing, an object, but he doesn't really elaborate on how our embodiment shapes our experience of space.
So that seems to be a point that later phenomenologists picked up on and developed further.
Yeah, there's definitely more to be said there. But for Heidegger, the focus is on the meaningfulness of space, how it's shaped by our concerns and projects.
Okay, and then we have being with.
Right. This is the social dimension of Dasein. Heidegger's point is that we're never alone in the world, even when we're physically by ourselves.
We're always already connected to others.
Exactly. It's not just that we happen to coexist with other people. Our very being is structured by our relationships with them.
So our identities, our roles, our understandings of ourselves.
All shaped by our social interactions.
And even the way we engage with the world, with tools and equipment, it's all informed by social practices and shared understandings.
Absolutely. Like if you think about a tool that's designed for a specific task, that design already presupposes a whole social context, a shared way of doing things.
So being with is kind of like the background condition for everything else.
It's a fundamental ontological structure. And Heidegger says there's a basic precognitive understanding of the other that's always already operating.
Like we just instinctively know how to interact with other people, how to navigate social situations.
Right. And then there's The anyone, das Man.
Which is?
This is the impersonal social normativity that kind of shapes how we understand the world.
So it's like the they and they say.
Exactly. It's the way things are generally done, the prevailing social customs and expectations.
And this gives rise to the anyone self, right?
Right. It's the self that's defined by those social norms, that understands itself through the lens of what one does.
It can be kind of comforting, right? You don't have to figure everything out for yourself. You just follow the script.
Yeah, it takes the pressure off. But it can also lead to a kind of inauthenticity, a loss of individuality.
Because you're not really choosing your own way of being. You're just conforming to the expectations of the anyone.
Exactly. And this stands in contrast to the authentic or ownmost self, which is about taking responsibility for your own choices and possibilities.
Okay, so we have the world, we have being with, and then the third component of being in the world is, well, being in itself.
Right, which Heidegger describes as a kind of familiarity, a sense of being at home in the world.
Not just being in the world, but being at home in it.
Exactly. And it's not just about knowing your way around, like having a good map.
It's about being attuned to the rhythms and possibilities of your world, flourishing within its practices, having the skills and habits to navigate it smoothly.
Right. And he breaks down this being in into three elements: disposedness, understanding, and discourse.
Okay, more jargon.
It's Heidegger. What do you expect?
True, but let's unpack them. So first up, disposedness.
Right, Befindlichkeit. This is about our fundamental affectivity, our moods, feelings, and emotions.
So the way the world shows up to us is always colored by our emotional state.
Exactly. And Heidegger says that moods aren't just subjective states, like something happening inside our heads. They're ways in which the world reveals itself to us.
So if I'm feeling anxious, that anxiety isn't just my own personal problem. It's also revealing something about the world, about the way things are showing up for me.
Exactly. It's disclosing a certain kind of meaning, a certain way of being in the world. And Heidegger emphasizes that disposedness isn't purely subjective or objective. It arises from our very being in the world, from our embeddedness in a context of meaning and concern.
It's like the world and the self are kind of co-constituting each other, shaping each other's meanings.
Yeah, and Dreyfus points out that moods can be shared, that they're often shaped by cultural background and social norms.
So it's not just that I feel anxious, it's that there's a certain cultural mood of anxiety that I'm participating in.
Right, and even things like scientific research, which we think of as objective, they often rely on certain moods.
Like a sense of wonder or curiosity.
Exactly. And then there's anxiety, angst.
Oh.
This is a big one for Heidegger.
Right, because it's not about being afraid of something specific.
Right, it's this more pervasive, unsettling feeling that arises from the very structure of Dasein itself.
It's like confronting the groundlessness of your own being.
Exactly. And because it disrupts our everyday coping, it forces us to confront the fundamental care that underlies our existence, our inherent concern for our own being.
So it's not a pleasant feeling, but it can be revealing.
It's like it shakes us out of our complacency and forces us to ask those deeper questions.
Now, there's been a lot of debate about what Heidegger means by anxiety, whether it's like a clinical condition or something more existential.
Right. Some scholars see connections to anxiety disorders, while others interpret it as a more fundamental ontological experience.
But either way, it seems to point to something pretty deep about the human condition. Okay, so we have disposedness. Next up, understanding.
Right. And
Yeah.
for Heidegger, this isn't just about knowing facts or information.
It's about grasping possibilities.
Exactly. He says understanding is projection onto possibilities.
So to understand something is to see its potential, its place within a horizon of possible actions and meanings.
Like, if you're understanding a game of chess, it's not just knowing the rules and the positions of the pieces.
It's about seeing the potential moves, the strategies, the overall aim of the game.
Exactly. You're grasping the possibilities inherent in the situation.
And finally, there's discourse read.
This is about articulating the intelligibility of being in the world, an intelligibility that's always already shaped by our moods and understanding.
So it's the way we make sense of things and communicate those meanings to others.
Right. And Heidegger distinguishes between genuine discourse, where we're actually trying to get at the truth of things, and idle talk, Giretti, which is more like just repeating cliches and opinions without really thinking about them.
So genuine discourse is about deepening our understanding, while idle talk is kind of superficial and empty.
Exactly. And Heidegger controversially claims that discourse is pre-linguistic, meaning that it's the foundation for language. He says that language arises from our understanding of being, from this fundamental capacity for making things intelligible.
And he gives examples like the call of conscience, which he says communicates without words.
Right. It's a way of making sense of a situation, of understanding what's required of us without needing explicit language.
But as our source points out, there's a lot of debate about how distinct discourse can really be from language as we typically understand it.
Yeah, it's a tricky issue. But for Heidegger, the key point is that there's a more primordial level of meaning-making that underlies our use of language.
Okay, so we've laid out the basic structure of Dasein's being in the world.
The foundation, so to speak.
And now Heidegger turns his attention to what he calls everydayness and fallenness.
Right. So in Division 1 of Being and Time, he's analyzing Dasein in its average, everyday mode of being.
The way we typically go about our lives, caught up in routines, social norms, practical concerns.
Exactly. And this is where the anyone really comes into play.
Because in our everydayness, we tend to just go along with what one does, what's socially expected.
Right. And Heidegger describes this as fallenness. He's using this religious imagery to capture the idea that we've kind of fallen away from our authentic possibilities.
We've become absorbed in the world, lost in the dictates of the anyone.
And he emphasizes that fallenness isn't just a bad choice that we can easily avoid. It's a fundamental ontological structure of Dasein.
So there's this inherent tendency to get caught up in the world, to lose ourselves in the inauthenticity of everydayness.
And this raises a tricky question, which is, if fallenness is so fundamental, is authenticity even possible?
Right, because if it's built into the structure of our being, how can we escape it?
Dreyfus tries to address this by distinguishing between fleeing and falling. Fleeing is a more deliberate attempt to avoid confronting your own most possibilities, to hide behind social roles and distractions.
So like running away from the hard questions.
Exactly. But falling is this more basic ontological tendency to just get absorbed in the world, to lose yourself in the flow of activities and social norms.
And Dreyfus argues that this kind of falling is actually a necessary part of our initial familiarity with the world.
It's how we first learn to navigate it, how we develop skills and habits.
So it's not all bad.
Right. But it does set the stage for the need for authenticity, for a more self-aware and responsible way of being in the world.
Okay, and that's where Division 2 of Being and Time comes in.
Right. This is where Heidegger shifts his focus to the possibility of authenticity, of Dasein becoming an individual, owning its own existence.
So what does he mean by authenticity?
Well, it's not about finding some true self that's hidden beneath social conditioning, like peeling away layers of an onion.
It's more about creating yourself, taking responsibility for your choices and possibilities.
Exactly. Kuiper defines it as choosing or achieving yourself in your being, as opposed to inauthenticity, which is losing or only seemingly achieving yourself.
So it's about actively shaping your own being, rather than just letting yourself be shaped by the world and the anyone.
And there are lots of different interpretations of what this owning of your being actually entails. Dreyfus, for example, sees it as akin to Aristotelian frenetic expertise,
Which is
a kind of skillful mastery of life, a way of navigating situations with wisdom and discernment that goes beyond just following the rules or social norms.
So it's about developing the practical wisdom to make the right choices in specific situations.
Exactly. Then there's a more transcendental interpretation, which focuses on the authentic individual's recognition of the norms and reasons that structure their experience.
So it's about becoming aware of the underlying structures that shape our understanding of the world.
Right. And then there's the narrative interpretation, which sees authenticity as about creating a coherent and meaningful life story.
So your life isn't just a series of random events. It's a story that you're actively authoring.
Exactly. And then there's the idea of fluid agency, which emphasizes the authentic individual's openness to new possibilities, their ability to respond creatively to the situations they encounter.
So it's not about clinging to a fixed identity or set of beliefs. It's about being adaptable, flexible, responsive.
Exactly. And all these interpretations have something in common, which is that authenticity is about owning your existence, taking responsibility for the choices you make and the possibilities you enact.
And Heidegger says that this process of becoming authentic is fundamentally enabled by two things: the anticipation of death and taking over guilt in resoluteness.
Yeah, those are pretty heavy hitters.
Let's start with death. What does Heidegger mean by that?
Well, first, it's important to understand his distinction between perishing, demise, and death proper.
Okay, more distinctions.
Heidegger loves his distinctions, but this one is crucial. So perishing is just the biological end of any living thing.
Like when a plant dies or an animal dies.
Right. Demise is the end of a person's social and legal status, their worldly involvements.
So their roles, their relationships, their projects.
Exactly. But death proper is something different. Heidegger says it's the possibility of the absolute impossibility of deathsane.
Which is a mouthful.
It is. But the basic idea is that death, for deathsane, is this unique possibility that throws our whole existence into question.
Because it's not just about our bodies ceasing to function.
Right. It's about the potential annihilation of all our possibilities, the end of our being in the world.
And Heidegger says that authentically anticipating death, facing up to this possibility, individualizes Dasein down to itself.
Right. It strips away all the superficialities, all the things that we cling to in our everydayness, and forces us to confront what really matters.
It's like a wake-up call.
Exactly. It makes us realize that our time is limited, that we don't have forever to become who we are.
Now, this whole death-demise distinction has been pretty controversial.
Oh yeah, some philosophers have dismissed it as just a linguistic game.
But others have defended it, saying that it captures something important about how Dasein experiences its own finitude.
Right. And there are a couple of different interpretations of what Heidegger's getting at here. One is the existential death interpretation, which sees death as the ultimate horizon of our possibilities.
So it's not just about dying physically, it's about the potential collapse of all our projects and meanings.
Exactly. And then there's the dual aspect or modal interpretation, which sees demise as the empirical biological event and death as that same event viewed from the perspective of Dasein's unique way of being.
So it's not two different things, but two different ways of understanding the same thing.
Right. And this view emphasizes that facing death, acknowledging our finitude, is what allows us to take responsibility for our choices and possibilities.
Because we realize that we don't have an infinite amount of time to waste.
Exactly. We have to make each moment count.
Okay, so that's death. Now what about guilt and resoluteness?
Right. So this gets to another fundamental aspect of Dasein, which is thrownness.
Thrownness. What's that?
It's the fact that we find ourselves already existing in a world that we didn't create with a specific history, a specific set of circumstances.
So we didn't choose to be born. We didn't choose our parents, our culture, our time period.
We're just thrown into it. And this highlights our finitude, the fact that we're not in control of our own being from the ground up.
So it's like a limitation on our freedom.
Yeah, but it's also the condition for our freedom. Because if we weren't thrown into the world, if we were just pure possibility, then there would be nothing to choose from.
Okay, that makes sense.
And Heidegger also emphasizes that Dasein doesn't have a fixed essence, like a blueprint that determines who we are.
So it's not like we're born with a set of pre-programmed characteristics that dictate how we're going to live our lives.
Exactly. We're constantly making ourselves, creating ourselves through our choices and actions.
But then, if we're thrown into the world and we don't have a fixed essence, how do we become authentic individuals?
That's the question. And Heidegger's answer is, that it.